The words structure and agency are often taken for granted in social science theory. These are things that you just know, right? Wrong. In this video, I'm going to explain what they mean and how you can use them in your critical analysis of theory. We'll begin with structure, move on to agency, and identify 3 key things you really need to know about the relationship between them. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, and for the last 2 decades, I've been teaching sociology, criminology, and social policy in UK universities. In that time, I've helped thousands of students understand theory and critical analysis, and I've used that experience to develop my digital course, Theory Boss. If you want to check that out, head to the link in the description to find out more. Without further ado, let's get started with structure. When we talk about structure, we're talking about overarching frameworks for social life, things that exist over and above the individual. Social institutions like education, family, religion, political systems and economies, and organisations like schools, households, churches or mosques, parliaments and corporations, they exist beyond the individual, over and above the individual. They're enduring, they're long-standing, they're stable, strong, substantial things. It's difficult for individuals to change them. They are relatively hard and solid. Now let's look at agency. When we talk about agency, we think about individuals with freedom, autonomy and choice. We think of free-willed, creative beings, subjective, unique. Agency is about actions, behavioural tendencies, traits and quirks, rituals, habits and routines, activities, ways of living, interacting with others through learning, having relationships, playing sports, eating, exercising, pursuing hobbies and interests, and all manner of other things. Structure and agency are often thought of as 2 distinct things, polar opposites. There's also a tendency to see structure as bad and agency as good. These are really limiting and simplistic ways to look at structure and agency, and I'm going to teach you a way of looking at them differently. Structure and agency are not completely separate. They are not polar opposites. In fact, they are interlinked, and there are 3 things we need to be aware of in terms of how they relate to each other. Firstly, structure can't exist without agency. Secondly, structure isn't necessarily a bad thing. And thirdly, agency isn't always about complete freedom. Let's take a look at each of those in turn. Firstly, structure can't exist without agency. Even though structure is something that transcends us as individuals, it's something that occurs in the background, over our heads, structures wouldn't exist in the first place if it wasn't for people doing stuff to create them. For example, the capitalist economy wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the actions of individual entrepreneurs, business people, managers and workers. The state education system wouldn't exist as it does if it wasn't for philanthropists and politicians and campaigners who demanded it in the first place, and if it wasn't for the teachers and the staff who work within it. Secondly, structure isn't necessarily a bad thing. There is a tendency to think about structure as something that's constraining, as something that limits people and holds them back and narrows their choices and options and orders them to live their lives in a particular way. So we can fall into the trap of thinking structure equals bad. But structures can be enabling as well as constraining. Think about education, for example, and that many countries in the world have a state education system that's free at the point of use. You don't have to pay to send your children to school. That structure, even though it's far from perfect, gives children opportunities that they wouldn't have otherwise had. If we think of another structural thing, language, for example, it makes thinking about things and communicating our understanding with others possible. So structures can limit us, but they also provide us with the tools to develop a sense of self and be creative and transformative. So they make freedom or agency possible. Without structures, there aren't any rules. Without any rules, there is no foundation or direction to our sense of self, which makes meaningful action kind of impossible. Thirdly, agency isn't simply about unfettered free will and limitless choices. Agency isn't really like this in reality. People have agency because there are always choices available to them, but the range of those choices are determined by the structures in which they live. You have the freedom to choose to go and get yourself a coffee from the coffee shop, but you can only choose from the coffees that are on the menu. You can go and buy yourself a new smartphone, but you can only choose from the models that are available. So alternative courses of action are always possible, but your choices are always limited by the set of structurally provided options. They're also limited by your position within that structure. Some people will have more options than others. For some, it might be a choice between everything on the Starbucks menu. For others, they have to take their own coffee to work because they're on a limited budget. Some people are able to choose between a 1 Series and a 3 Series BMW to use for their commute. Others have to choose between walking or taking the bus. It's fair to say that most of the time people engage in actions that reproduce the prevailing structures of social life. We simply choose from what's available to us, that which exists within our structure, and in choosing those things, we are reproducing that structure. Sometimes we go against the grain. Sometimes we decide not to get married. We decide not to have children. We decide that we don't want to buy a house in that area. We decide that we're not going to put that thing on our credit card. We're not just going to agree with our boss on this particular day. Perhaps we decide to give up our job and go and live in a tent in the woods. But does that change capitalism? Does that change society? No, those deeper structures of social life remain intact. Does that mean that capitalism or society can never be changed? Well, no, it doesn't. Because if enough people decided to go against the grain in the same ways, the cumulative effect of that would start to rock the system. And this stuff has happened. For example, if people decide that they are not happy with the current political order, they can overthrow it in a revolution. It's rare, but it happens. One person can decide that they are never going to go to that coffee shop ever again because they didn't like the coffee and the barista was just rude. Will that lead to the coffee shop closing down though, through lack of business? Well, no. But if 100 regular customers made the same decision, then yeah, that structure may well change. However, the more enduring a structure is, the more challenging it is to change it. So those are the 3 key things that are useful to remember about structure and agency. They are interlinked. One cannot exist without the other. And although the relationship between them might not be completely harmonious, it is a relationship nonetheless, and it's one that we need to remember exists. Hopefully now you're feeling a bit more confident with structure and agency. Let's briefly recap what I've just covered. Structures are durable and operate above the level of the individual. However, without individuals, they wouldn't exist in the first place, and they wouldn't continue to exist. Structures can constrain us in that they place limits on what we're able to do, but they enable us at the same time in that they make certain options possible. They give us choices. And agency is all about choices. Those choices become possible within the structures that exist. As humans, the choices that we make tend to reproduce those structures. The possibility of changing structures is a real one. It's a rare one, but it's a real one. Human agency and social structure are not separate. They are mutually dependent. If you're thrown by theory or confused by critical analysis, you should check out my digital course, Theory Boss. I empower smart social science students on top postgraduate programs who don't feel that they're getting the grades they deserve to master theory and crush critical analysis so they can ace their assignments and write dazzling dissertations. Head to the link in the description to find out more about Theory Boss. I will be back here very soon with more tips on critical analysis and theory.